So here we're going to look at principles of test selection administration. So now we kind of get, and again, it's kind of the end of the class, but as I said, towards the end here, we kind of get a little bit more into the practically applied information as it relates to strength and conditioning, meaning the stuff where we actually start to talk about, some programming things and considerations we take into that when kind of developing physical performance programs. Certainly, this will be information that we revisit. For those of you who will be taking other strength and conditioning courses, we'll be revisiting some of this information, but this gets us into some of the applied information as it relates to the application of strength and conditioning principles. So when we look at this and ask the reason, why do we test? So there's a lot of different reasons why we test. Again, we look to assess athletic talent, physical abilities. We look to areas that they need improvement. Allows individuals to set goals to accomplish. So again, they could look at, group and team objectives as it relates to athletic abilities, and just kind of provides individuals a way to just sort of, look at what physical abilities they need and kind of what they really need to focus on with their programming. So, again, just to kind of sum up, so we assess talent, we identify physical abilities that are in need of improvement, set goals, evaluate progress, or why we look to evaluate. And again, different athletes obviously have very, significantly different requirements. If we look at the three athletes in this picture, you're definitely looking at three individuals who all have definite physical goals. Now, again, in general, when we look at most athletics, all athletes need a level of strength. All athletes need a level of explosiveness, a certain amount of endurance, everything. But again, it's in varying amounts, and the ways in which you address it are going to vary. And obviously, we want to make sure that we test certain physical abilities, specifically as it relates to the best performance the athletes can produce. Now, here's a list of key terms. I am not going to define these individually in this presentation. What I'm going to ask you to do is, in your notes, make a little definitions list of what these things are. Again, they're basic key terms that you're going to look at that you could define as it relates to testing. So, in your book, look up the definitions, and in your notes, just kind of write them down. If there's a definition that you're unclear of or not sure as to the application of, we can discuss that when we have our online meeting. Now, looking at testing quality, there's two primary things we look at, and then there's subtypes of each one of these. So the idea of validity is the degree to which a test or test item measures what it's supposed to measure. Okay, so that's validity. So that's one of the most important characteristics of tests. In other words, if we say that a test, looks at a certain quality, it has to definitely show that it measures it. Okay, so a test is a valid test if it measures what it's supposed to. A test is considered reliable based on the degree of consistency or repeatability of it, meaning if you do the test over and over again, are you going to get the same results? Okay, so that's what reliability looks at, and the reliability of a test may differ between groups based on differences in physical or emotional maturity and skill level. So a test must be reliable to be valid. Okay, so that's an important point, because again, if you get highly variable test results, they could have very little meaning. Okay, so again, validity, does the test measure what it's supposed to measure for? Reliability, is it a consistent test? Can you repeat it and get the similar results? Now, again, here we look at some things. Again, I'm going to have you look up the definition of these, okay, to make it kind of a little bit more meaningful as opposed to me just going over them here. And then another thing we're going to do when we meet in class is I'm going to do kind of just a brief little activity to kind of see if you could differentiate between these different types of validity. So you have construct validity, face validity, content validity, criterion reference, concurrent, predictive, and discriminant. So again, in your notes, make a little section. just do the definitions, okay? Kind of see your textbook gives examples, and hopefully that's helpful. If there's, again, confusion, we'll kind of hash that out in class with some activities that we're going to do when we meet online. And then we have the same things here with reliability. So take these subtypes of validity, subtypes of reliability. So reliability, you have intra-subject variability, inter-rater reliability, and intra-rater variability. Again, define these, look at the examples, and again, if there's any sort of confusion or anything like that, again, please let me know in class. And like I said, we'll do some activities just to kind of cover these to make sure that everyone's on the same page with them. So when we look at test selection, there's certain things, there's certain considerations obviously we have to look at. So in what we have up here, so we have metabolic energy system specificity, biomechanical movement pattern specificity, experience and training status, and age and gender. So for a test to be valid, it has to emulate the energy requirements of the sport, meaning that when you look at the energy systems that are available or the energy demands, you have to consider the test you're using. The tests have to be specific to that. So there's three primary energy systems that we look at when we look at the energy systems in the body. You have the phosphagen system, also known as the ATP-PC system or the phosphocreatine system. That's your immediate source of energy. You have the glycolytic system or your lactic acid system, which is your intermediate system, and then you have the oxidative or the aerobic system. So the first two systems are actually anaerobic, so they produce energy without oxygen. Again, the phosphagen system or the ATP-PC system. Some people also refer to that as the alactic system because it doesn't produce lactic acid. That's your immediate short burst, and then your other anaerobic system is your glycolytic. Again, anaerobic, glycolytic, lactic acid system, intermediate system. That's your other anaerobic system, and then the oxidative, as I said, is aerobic. Again, you want to match what you're doing that's specific for the athletes to the testing. If you're testing something that doesn't replicate it, then you're testing it for the sake of testing it. And I'll give one example that's a commonly abused test that doesn't really have any carryover. When you look at most of your team sports, a lot of your team sports, they test mile run, mile and a half, 2 mile runs. And for the bulk of your sports, those are invalid tests. They don't test the energy system as appropriate for those sports. So if you're a soccer player, a field hockey player, a lacrosse player, whatever, and your coaches are having you run 1 mile, mile and a half, 2 mile tests, those are invalid tests for those sports. They're not based off of metabolic energy system specificity. So really it's just testing for the sake of testing. Biomechanical movement pattern specificity looks at, again, kind of the more similar the test is to movement in the sport, the better. So again, there's certain movement patterns you want to look at. Experience and training status, you just have to consider, does the person have the ability to perform the test? You know, so for instance, if you bring in athletes, you know, I used to have this with my freshman field hockey players. I wouldn't have them come in and I wouldn't test their 1 rep max squat strength because I wasn't sure if they all knew how to squat. Some of them might have, some of them might not have. But since I didn't know, I didn't test them. So the freshmen had a different battery of tests than the returning players had, because I didn't want to test them in something that I'm not sure of what their experience, what it is. And age and gender has a little bit to do with this too. Again, the only reason being is they might affect their experience. Okay, so that's something to consider. So these are things you want to look at when you're looking at test selection. We're going to be discussing different tests in the next section. And, you know, we'll talk about, you know, even some of the tests in your book, some of them aren't as good as maybe it's thought they are, and we'll discuss kind of how they could be applied to different sports. Next, you have to look at environmental factors. So again, the reason why you have to look at environmental factors is because obviously, you know, temperature can possibly affect the results of your test. Plus, it can also make things, you know, potentially dangerous for the athletes when you look at things like heat illness. So, and in particular, high temperature and high humidity has a big chance to impair performance, pose health risks, and even possibly lower the validity, particularly of endurance-based tests. And it should be noted that performance is impaired above 80 degrees, especially when the humidity is above 50. Okay, so and I want you to think about what would make humidity part of the issue. Okay, so there's just a little general thought question for yourself. It's not a discussion board or anything like that. I just want you to think about that. I'll probably bring up that question again in our class discussion as to, what's the effect that humidity has. Okay, another thing that could possibly impair performance is altitude. Okay, now that altitude tends to be more of an issue when it just strictly comes to aerobic endurance tests, usually tests of strength and power. There's usually not as much of a factor with altitude. So those are things we have to keep in mind with the environment. And again, to make sure that the test is standardized, particularly if you're tracking things over a long period of time, you want to sort of look at the environment and make sure that things are kind of consistent with that. Again, health and safety considerations. We talked about this a little bit already in the previous slide, looking at aerobic endurance testing in the heat, particularly when it's both high heat and high humidity. You want to be observant of signs and symptoms of health problems. Make sure you look at, all your athletes should have filled out health history forms, and you should kind of note any type of red flags that would be present. And again, be observant of their health statuses both before, during, and after maximal exertions. That's going to be important. In the weeks leading up to the test, athletes should engage in enough training to make sure they have a good fitness baseline. They should acclimatize for at least 1 week prior to testing. So in other words, their sweat rates and everything, the process of acclimatization is where the athlete's sweat rates, they basically get used to the heat. So it's really important that they have at least 1 week of acclimatization before actually coming to preseason camp, going through testing, and then participating in those activities. They should make sure they're adequately hydrated, particularly for prolonged activities. They recommend a 5 to 10% carbohydrate solution. After athletes participate in exercise in the heat, they should weigh themselves. They should try to consume 24 ounces of fluid for each pound of body weight loss, because that body weight loss is coming in the way of losing water. So if they don't make up for that, they kind of enter their next upcoming sessions dehydrated already and put themselves at risk for that. So they have to make sure that they're making up for that. Again, on days when temperature is high, if you have access to indoor facilities, you should try to use those. Testing should be conducted during the morning or early evening hours, because that's the time when the temperature is going to be at its lowest. And again, we talked about the whole acclimatization period. Athletes should also make sure they're well hydrated in a 24-hour period, because once they're already out and practicing, again, the water that they drink or whatever fluids it is they would be consuming while they're participating in practice in the heat, it's already too late. At that point, they're kind of just maintaining. So you certainly do want to encourage them to drink during exercise in the heat, but you want to make sure they're well hydrated in the time leading up to it. And again, clothing, light colored, loose fitting, tank top, shorts are most beneficial for that. So again, what are we looking for as far as health concerns? So we're looking for signs and symptoms of heat stroke or heat exhaustion. So cramps, nausea, dizziness, difficulty walking or standing. So they kind of look like they're, losing their balance, faintness, garbled speech, lack of sweat, red or ashen skin, goosebumps are all things to be aware of. You also want to be aware of what's called hyponatremia. Now, hyponatremia is something that kind of goes a little under the radar. It's actually, another name for it is water intoxication. So it's actually a situation where athletes are overly hydrated, particularly with plain water, and what happens is their sodium levels actually drop too low. So that's also of a concern. It gets a little tricky because sometimes, and I'm speaking from the medical side as an athletic trainer, It could sometimes be hard to differentiate between the two. Typically, people with water intoxication or hyponatremia, they have some specific symptoms. Extremely dilute urine, bloated skin, altered or loss of consciousness. Typically, what you find is they'll have some of the neurological symptoms may be associated with heat illness, but they'll have no real big increase in body temperature. So that's usually one of the biggest delineating factors. But these individuals, again, that's a medical emergency, much like the other heat illnesses. Obviously, the treatment's going to be much different. If you suspect somebody of having hyponatremia, you obviously don't try to just rehydrate them with water because that's kind of part of the problem to start with. But those are some of the particular issues that we look at as far as health concerns in the heat. And again, you want to make sure that you're checking their health history forms to see if they would have anything in their past history that would possibly cause that. And then selection and training of testers. Again, you want to make sure anyone involved with testing has good practice and training. It's going to just ensure consistency. That will help with the reliability of your testing if everyone's trained and they kind of know what they look for. You're probably going to have recording forms. Again, prepare them ahead of time and just make sure that everyone kind of knows how to utilize the recording forms. Again, just as a for instance, I used to be very heavily involved, again, with field hockey and their preseason tests. And, you know, the coaches used to help me because as far as from the strength and conditioning side of thing, I was the only person that did anything with that. So, you know, the coaches would help me with this. So I would have a meeting with the coaches, go over everything. They were pretty well versed. And again, it just the communication just kind of helped with making sure that we had reliable test results. So test format, so consider whether athletes will be tested all at once or in groups. The same tester should make sure to administer a given test to all athletes if possible. Again, this could sometimes be a little difficult depending on the amount of athletes and the time frame you have. If that's not the case, again, the communication is important. Each tester should administer one test at a time. So if you have to have multiple testers, they should really only allow one test at a time to make sure that you know, again, you're being consistent. They're able to see what's going on with the results of the tests. And then testing battery and multiple testing trials. So, you know, there can be duplicate test setups for large groups. Again, what you want to do is, as far as the different testing trials, you want to allow at least 2 minutes of rest between attempts that are not close to an athlete's maximum. So if there's any sort of test that doesn't, you know, take an athlete to maximal outputs, you want at least 2 minutes rest between attempts. If there are attempts between maximum results, so take, for instance, you know, maximum power strength tests, you know, if they have multiple trials, multiple sets of that, you want to make sure there's at least 3 minutes of rest at a minimum that are close to maximum attempts, and at least 5 minutes between test batteries, okay? Meaning that, you know, at least 5 minutes of rest between the individual tests. Now, as far as your sequence of testing is concerned, so this is what's recommended. Now, ideally, if you can do your test battery over the course of multiple days, that's suggested. Again, many instances that's not going to be the case. If you have to do all of your testing in one day, you start with your non-fatiguing tests, and that's usually stuff that looks more like, you know, testing anthropometry, like weight, height, stuff like that, anything that doesn't fatigue the individual. Next would be your agility tests, then maximum power and strength tests, sprint tests where you're testing for speed, local muscular endurance tests, fatiguing anaerobic capacity tests, and then aerobic capacity tests. So if you were doing all of those in one day, that would be your order. Now that would be a lot to test in one day. I would not, you know, from a practical standpoint, I would not suggest doing that all in one day, but if you had to, that's what you would do. Do it in that order, because the idea is that the test at the end, so say for instance you did your fatiguing anaerobic capacity test first. The issue there would be is that would have a bigger impact on all the other tests that you do. So in other words, say in one day you were just going to do fatiguing anaerobic capacity tests and you were going to test someone's lower body strength through a squat. Well, if you go out and run somebody through a fatiguing anaerobic capacity test, even if you give them a full rest period, even if you give them 10 minutes rest, they're still not going to be completely ready to do the squat. Whereas if you have them do the 1 rep max squat first, that'll have much less of an effect on the fatiguing anaerobic capacity test. So that's kind of the justification for that order, is that you look at tests that aren't going to have as big of an impact from a fatigue standpoint that will somehow disrupt the results of the tests that come after it. So again, how do we best prepare athletes for testing? Again, some common sense organization things. Announce the date, time, and purpose of a test battery in advance. Maybe host a pre-test practice session, or at the very least, just let them know what tests they're going to be doing. Provide clear and simple instructions. Demonstrate proper test performance. Organize a warm-up, an appropriate warm-up for the athletes to truly prepare them for what they're going to do. Tell the athletes their scores after each trial so they kind of know where they stand. And then, again, a supervised cool-down period, which is important to make sure that, again, the athletes sort of recover from what it is that they're doing. Okay, so again, just some basic things, but those are sometimes things we tend to forget about when we're just looking at the organization. We concern ourselves with, what are we testing for? How are we doing the tests? Again, these things can just kind of help prepare the athletes for that. And these are your learning outcomes. So again, we kind of just talk about some basics behind the tests. We're going to talk about specific tests in the upcoming chapters, but this kind of outlines sort of the procedures, the processes to design and what goes into deciding what you would look to test for.